very busy schedules to join today. There are quite a few of us, so if you could just make sure that your mics are muted, that would be great, just to reduce as much background noise as possible. If you have any questions throughout to our guest speakers, please do pop them into the Q&A box or the chat function, and I can bring them up at the best time. A quick thank you to Craig for joining us today. Our Natalie from Impero is very unwell at the minute, so she's had to bow out. So big thank you to Craig for stepping in. Another note is just for those of you who like the traditional pen and paper method, taking notes and things like that, don't panic if you can't get everything down, because this will be recorded and it will be distributed to you guys, so you can look back over it in your own time. So I think without further ado, we'll get started. For those of you who don't know much about Impero, we are a tech company, and we specialise in providing solutions for education and the corporate sectors. Looking into the education side of things, we provide schools, colleges, universities with classroom management, remote control, safeguarding and monitoring, and of course, web filtering software, and have been doing so for almost 20 years. We've pushed this webinar in particular, not only because it's Anti-Bullying Week, and we are all thinking about words and their impact on and offline, but also because having an appropriate level of web filtering software in place is now a requirement. I'm going to pass this on to the wonderful Charlotte Aynsley, who will introduce herself and pass it on to other guest speakers to just give a brief introduction and introduce themselves. Charlotte, over to you.
Thank you, Lulu. My name's Charlotte Aynsley. I am an independent safeguarding consultant, and I've been working with Impero since 2016, helping them and advising them on the best way forward in terms of safeguarding and digital safeguarding as well. As Lulu has already said, today we want to specifically talk about a few issues, particularly around online bullying and how to create a safer environment for children, both online and offline. But before I go into any detail, I'm going to hand over to Jonathan, who I know wants to introduce himself to you. Jonathan.
Hi there, I am Jonathan Coy, the co-founder of Head Teacher Chat on Twitter and Facebook. I was a deputy CEO of an academy trust until very recently, and I was a head teacher before that. So I have a lot of experience and understanding of how safeguarding works in school. And thank you for inviting me to be a panelist today.
Thank you, Jonathan. Craig, do you want to introduce yourself? I can't hear you, Craig.
I'm on mute, apologies. Yeah, hi, I'm Craig Butler. I'm the Sales and Development Manager for NetSuite. I've been working in the safeguarding space for the last 10 years. So yeah, I'm glad to be on the panel, and hopefully I can answer any technical questions that you might have. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, Craig. Just before we start, I wanted to ask you if in the chat you could just put a thumbs up if you are a safeguarding lead in your setting. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, and then Lulu can tell me, because I can't see the chat. If you're a safeguarding lead in your setting, put a thumbs up so we can just see what kind of people. How many have we got, Lulu?
So we have got, they are coming in thick and fast. We've got 5 so far. 6,
okay.
7. Yeah, 7 so far. 8, 9.
And how many, if you could just put a thumbs up if you're a network manager or an ICT lead in your setting.
Yeah, we've got 1, 2, 3. 4.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I just wanted to, I know we've got quite a mix in the delegate list, and I wanted to check exactly what kind of roles you have in school. So welcome in intros, welcome to everybody. And as Lulu said, we're delighted to have you here, especially in this busy time. I know the run up to Christmas is really tricky. We're going to set the scene initially. So we're going to talk about some of the policy context in relation to digital safeguarding. There's quite a lot happening at the moment around the protection of children online, nationally actually, not just necessarily in the school sector. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the new and emerging risks in the sector. So some of the risks to children, particularly since COVID, and the way that COVID has affected the risk-taking behaviour that children partake in online, but also the risks that they're exposed to in the online context as well. We're going to talk about bullying and its impact, particularly cyberbullying, as it's Anti-Bullying Week, and we've got a video to show you. You probably know it's Anti-Bullying Week already. You've probably been doing lots of stuff in school around Anti-Bullying Week, but we're going to look at some of the impacts of particularly cyberbullying in relation to children and young people. Then I'm going to hand over to my colleagues from Impero, and they're going to talk to you about some of the products that Impero have to help to try and manage and prevent bullying, particularly in the online context. Don't worry, we're not going to give you the hard sell. We just want to demo to you some of the ways that you can use one of Impero's products to help to protect children online. And then finally, we're going to talk about reporting systems and what sorts of things you might need to consider if you're setting up an internal reporting and recording system for students around bullying. And we're going to focus in on some of the issues as to why children don't tell us what's happening, how it affects them, and how we can make it a little bit easier for them to tell us what's going on in a school setting. I just wanted to start off by talking about the motivations for being online. I used to show this slide years ago, and I used to get a little bit of a laugh. People, you know, talking about their kids. So you take them to the most amazing places on holiday, and the first question they ask is, "Mum, is there Wi-Fi?" But Wi-Fi really has become an intrinsic part of children's lives, particularly in the last 18 months during the pandemic. And it really has become a kind of core offering, so much so that we as a nation decided that, you know, we need to give all children access. And never was that more apparent than during the pandemic. So children kind of driving the demand a lot around Wi-Fi and access to technology. And particularly now, you know, if the pandemic had happened 10, 15 years ago, it would have been a very different story. Children missing out on their education, people not being able to work. So it really has become quite an intrinsic part of motivation and engagement and inclusivity for children. I wanted to talk a little bit about children's access to tech and how that has changed again in the last 18 months. And I probably don't need to tell you, because you work with children all day, every day. Probably many of you have children as well. But Ofcom every year do an analysis of children online, and they also do an analysis of parental attitudes to their children online. And this is a year-on-year survey. These statistics are from 2020, so kind of slightly out of kilter with the pandemic. But one of the first lines in the Ofcom report this year was that almost all children had been online. And normally it hovers around 90%. There's always a slight percentage of children that don't go online at all, regardless of age. But this year, Ofcom's opening gambit was all children had been online. And that shouldn't come as a great surprise to us, again, given the pandemic and given the fact that we were busily getting children access so that they could continue their learning. The impact of this has been quite significant, because lots of parents have had busy schedules themselves, haven't had the opportunity to supervise their children in quite the same way that they would do normally, because they've been trying to hold down a job, do a bit of homeschooling, manage all of these complexities and challenges. So it's been quite significant in terms of the exposure that children can have to nasty content, to things that we wouldn't necessarily want them to see. The other significant change has been around the way that children 5 years ago went from a situation where we were downloading content. So we were downloading music, we were downloading films. Now what we do is we upload content. User-generated content has exploded, and VSP platforms, video sharing platforms, particularly like TikTok, have exploded onto the scene. TikTok used to be called Musical.ly, probably about 3 or 4 years ago. And in terms of statistics, it's seen a 45% increase in monthly active users. It was downloaded 689 million times. The only app ever to exceed any of Facebook's apps, and particularly during the pandemic, you will have seen hashtags trending around lockdown, around COVID, and children getting a lot of their information from these kinds of platforms. So significant impact on the way children are learning, the way that they're finding out information, the way that they're sharing information, the way that they are communicating. TikTok now has 1 billion users. Facebook is at a similar level. It's fast overtaking Facebook, or not Facebook anymore, is it? It's doesn't want to be known as Facebook anymore. It's a bit like Prince when he wanted to change his name. It doesn't want to be known as Facebook anymore. Meta is what we're talking about. So again, significant changes in the way that children are using media, what they're sharing, misinformation, disinformation. You can also see that in terms of the use of social media, on the left-hand side there, you can see that even very little children are still using social media. You can see that 30% of children in that age bracket, in the 5 to 7 age bracket, are still using social media. We all know that the age is 13. However, many children and many parents deciding that it's appropriate for their children. It goes up to 44% for 8 to 11-year-olds, and it goes up again to 87%. And around the time of 11 to 14, it actually doubles in terms of its usage. And most children are quite delineated in terms of how they use technology. So they'll use their Xbox or their games console for playing games. They might also use it for communicating as well, especially if they're playing multiplayer games. They use their tablet for kind of watching stuff, surfing. And then often they use their phone or they use a laptop for learning. So there are some quite distinctive activities that children do in relation to how they use different devices, different technologies. The other significant impact on children has been the way that children are sold to in this environment. You can see in the 12 to 15 age group, 65% of children are aware of potential vlogger endorsements. So children are increasingly aware of the fact that YouTubers and people on TikTok, influencers, are affecting what they buy, what they like. And there's been a huge increase in the amount of money that's spent in those less traditional marketing arenas. It's really been quite a shift from kind of your normal, typical marketing below the line that you would have seen. It's shifted very much into that influencer sphere. So huge impact in terms of what children do, the way they operate. Most children still, smartphones very prevalent for young children, but most children tending to have a smartphone around the age of 11. So that kind of tipping point when they go to secondary school, they might be going on the bus, mum and dad want to know that they're okay and they're safe. So still that typical tipping point for most children. In terms of the policy context, I just wanted to kind of go over some of the things that are happening nationally. You probably know about some of these already. There've been some updates to keeping children safe in education, which we're going to talk about in a moment. There's the online safety bill, which is having its current scrutiny, which has gone from the online harms bill to the online safety bill, which very much focuses around the protection of children in the online context. It focuses around ensuring there is age verification, so making sure that what children get when they're online is age appropriate. It places a duty of care onto the social networks, so it is incumbent upon them to check that the content that is being fed to children is appropriate and safe, in inverted commas. It means that they have to have appropriate reporting mechanisms for children, so that children are able to report inappropriate and illegal content, and more importantly, to get a response. And if that doesn't happen, then these companies and individuals within those companies will be fined, and they will be fined as a proportion of their turnover. So you can imagine Meta and its turnover. If they don't meet a lot of these requirements, they're going to be significantly fined going forward. Australia is kind of leading the charge in this area. They're about to have their Online Safety Act go through Parliament, and they're kind of going slightly above and beyond the online safety bill currently by making sure that there is an independent arbitrator, which is the e-safety commissioner in Australia, who will act as the kind of point of reference if you feel that your complaint to a social media site isn't acted upon quickly enough. What already is enshrined in law, it's already enacted. It came into force on the 1st of September 2020. Companies were given a year, so 1st of September this year, to get themselves ready for the age appropriate design code. And that essentially is more focused on children's data and protecting children in a more commercial sense. But it does include things like making sure that companies always act on the best interests of the child. They introduce age verification. They make sure that inappropriate content isn't being fed to children. They protect children in the online environment. They make sure that there is a reporting mechanism in place, and they make sure that all of this is done in a very child-friendly way, which is very important because we all know we kind of flick through the terms and conditions and the cookies and the preferences on a lot of the sites that we visit. So one of the principles in there is about making sure that it's appropriate for children. So lots of companies across the world globally are kind of rushing to get their act together to make sure that they are in compliance with the age appropriate design code, which was developed by the Information Commissioner's Office. The other thing that's happened is the Ofsted review. So sexual abuse in schools, the impact that that's had. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later on in terms of peer abuse and keeping children safe. Ofsted have also updated their inspecting safeguarding guidance for schools. That's been slightly updated as well. And on top of that, we've had the impact of the pandemic and home learning. So schools trying to continue to protect children, and really DSL is doing some absolutely heroic things like going to kids' houses and looking over the fence and checking that they're okay. So there's lots and lots going on, lots to consider, and quite a few policy changes, both in relation to the school sector specifically, but also more nationally as well. So in terms of keeping children safe in education then, you may have all seen this before. We talk about, in the online context, protecting children from what we call the 3 Cs. And they are the content risks. So that's children passively coming across content that might harm them in some way. So a good example, for example, is pornographic content. So protecting children from being able to access this stuff, particularly in a school school context. Children as participants. So this is the way that they operate online, or somebody might be contacting them and they might be trying to groom them, they might be bullying them. And then the final one is how children act themselves. So again, a good example here is children sharing, for example, user-generated content that might be sexual, which is sometimes known as sexting. So in terms of your approach to this, when you're planning, developing your approach to digital safeguarding, what I always ask schools and teachers is, if I asked you to kind of shine a light and think about where the biggest risks are to the children in your setting, in your school, what would you say? What would you say you are most worried about? What are the things that you feel that you need to protect children from? It's really important that you understand what they are. And the best way to do that is to ask the children directly, to ask them specific questions, perhaps do that anonymously, because sometimes the sorts of things that us as adults and the sorts of things that children are worried about, they don't necessarily tally. So it's always a good idea to ask them. And we do have some questionnaires that you could use to help you gauge the responses and to really understand the sorts of things that children are worried about. This year, we've had the introduction of a fourth C. So this is in keeping children safe in education. And we've had the introduction of the fourth C, which is commerce. And what this is really asking schools to do is to protect children from risks that might be associated with financial scams. So making sure that they are protected from gambling sites, from advertising, from phishing emails. So it does kind of touch on more on the cybersecurity side as well. So again, when you're planning your approach, have a think about some of the sorts of things that children could be exposed to within your setting, within your school. I'm just going to pause there just for 1 minute and ask you again in the chat, if you think about that table, where do you see the risks for your students, for your school? Where would you say that the main risks are for your students? I don't know if you want to say something, Jonathan, from your experience about some of the sorts of risks that you experienced in terms of the school that you were in previously.
Yeah, thank you for all the information you shared so far. That's actually wonderful, really good. The biggest one we found in the schools I worked in was the bullying, the peer-to-peer bullying outside school, and how to identify and how to limit the risk, and actually how to educate everyone about that, including the parents. And it's a huge risk and a huge challenge for schools, because you only hear a little bit of it that comes into schools. And that's going to, what you just started talking about, is actually how do we listen to the children and actually make sure their voices are heard across the whole sector of the schooling. And you will allude to girls at the moment, it's sort of like having a real issue of actually talking and people listening to their advice. So bullying is one of the biggest risks that we have, and it's very useful that we're sharing this information today.
Thank you, Jonathan. Would people agree with that? Would they agree that bullying is one of the major risks? Lulu, anything in the chat?
So looking at the chat, we've actually got a range of answers. So we've had conduct, content and contact as concerns, areas for concern. One particular answer was that there is a lot of children who come across things that they shouldn't see on devices at home because there aren't parental controls in place. And the issue is trying to educate the parents. And apparently that itself is quite a tricky job. And also they've said contact is also an issue, especially during lockdown. They were speaking to people that they didn't know, especially when playing things like multiplayer games.
Yeah, I think one of the kind of messages that we always hear from schools is that it's a challenge working with parents on this issue, and we can come back to that later on when we visit the whole school approach towards the end of the presentation. But what I would say is, I used to work for a parenting organisation, and it's kind of the same gripe from parents as it is from schools. And if we could meet somewhere in the middle and maybe make sure that we are communicating with parents in a way that they like to be communicating with, then I think we can have a really strong impact on parents. Because what we do know is that often parents do come to schools, particularly if there is a problem, especially with things like sexting and bullying. Even if it's happened outside of school, the ramifications are brought back into schools. So they often do quite lean on schools quite a lot. So there are lots of ways to engage parents, and it can sometimes feel a bit frustrating for schools because they feel like they're doing everything they can. But there's some great advice, information out there for parents. Thank you for that. This is a nice segue. I just wanted to quickly go over some of the risks that we've seen, especially during the pandemic, that have really come out quite strongly and quite sadly in some cases. One of the big startling statistics which happened very early on in the pandemic was the amount of child sexual abuse imagery that was being downloaded. So the Internet Watch Foundation did a review, I think it was back in April 2020, so it was in the very first lockdown, and the numbers had increased by 80%. So you can only infer from that if you are an offender and you have a sexual interest in children, because of the reduction in kind of direct access, many people were turning to the internet. So we've seen some horrible statistics around the numbers of paedophiles downloading images and trading and sharing images. And in fact, I was looking earlier on today at some of the stats from the NSPCC. So the NSPCC did a freedom of information request to all local forces, and they found that there was a 70% increase in crimes against children online recorded. Half of the offences happened on Meta-owned apps, and Instagram was the main culprit. So Instagram was the most common platform, and from the big four, so Snapchat, Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook, 74% of them, all of the cases that were reported across the local force happened across those big four platforms. So lots of activity happening within those environments. And again, if you do follow the kind of local the news around these issues, you will know that Facebook have had a few technological failures in terms of retrieving sexual abuse images. So there's a lot of challenge to Meta and Zuckerberg himself around how they're going to support police in making sure that these images are not shared across some of their platforms. In terms of challenges, I just wanted to say something about the kind of whole TikTok environment. It can be really incredibly positive, the TikTok environment. And Jonathan and Lulu and I were talking about this yesterday in terms of children finding information, sharing positive challenges, body confidence challenges, physical challenges. But there are some challenges which are really quite harmful for children. And one of those was the blackout challenge that happened, I think it was last year, where children were encouraged to kind of see if they could hold their breath and for how long, and lots of them blacked out and fainted. So there are some quite negative things that can happen again within that environment. And again, you'll have seen in the last few days, children sharing videos of teachers, videoing teachers in the classroom and sharing them within that environment and putting them in a TikTok environment. So again, it can be quite negative. Addiction and increased usage. China has become the first country in the world to actually start to regulate children's use and to restrict the amount of usage that the amount of time that children can spend online. And in the last couple of years, we've seen the first clinic in the UK to treat internet addiction, particularly for children and particularly related to online gaming. And because lots of us have found our kind of social contact within the online environment, that has become increasingly risky for some children. The other areas are the kind of sharing of nude imagery, user-generated content, which again has seen a rise during the pandemic. The peak kind of age for nude image sharing is normally around 14. Not always done in a kind of sinister way. Some people exploring their sexuality, some people exploring a relationship, you know, the kind of 21st century modern day equivalent of behind the bike sheds, but operating in the online environment. Sadly for children though, it's not as easy as we would hope to be able to help them to remove some of that content. So it can have quite a severe impact on them. Again, there's lots of resources, lots of help for schools and for young people to help them to understand the consequences, to think about what they're sharing and to report images if that does happen. And then the final one is around the increase of bullying and online hate, which again, sadly, has seen quite an increase during the pandemic and most definitely recently. So quite a lot of changes, quite a lot of bleak statistics and things that as a school, as a parent, as an adult, we really need to support children and young people navigating their way around this kind of online context. I'm just going to play you, this leads me into a nice segue of Anti-Bullying Week, and I just wanted to play you, it's only about a minute long, the video that the Anti-Bullying Alliance have published for this week. And the theme is one kind word for Anti-Bullying Week this year. Can everybody hear it okay?
Our actions and words are powerful. They can change our minds, our thoughts, our feelings, be it online, emotional, physical. Bullying affects us all. It hurts, it scars, it shames,
it pressures us,
it changes us. And that negativity is infectious, convincing us it can't be stopped. But change has to start somewhere.
Kindness is
Respect, support. Kindness is unity.
kindness is including something.
Kindness is beautiful. How we say, do, click, write, share, and post means something. When we show kindness by giving a smile.
Not sharing that video,
Including someone.
saying stop.
Our small actions make a big difference. And that kindness is contagious. It flows through us like a waterfall, like a river that becomes a tidal wave. So let's make it a new normal.
Pass that kindness on. All it takes is one small change to start the chain of kindness.
One kind word could make their day much better.
Make us feel less alone. One kind word can lift others up.
They can change our confidence.
What a difference one kind word can make.
I don't know if you're all using the resources from Anti-Bullying Week, but they've got some brilliant resources for primary and secondary school secondary schools. It's all on the Anti-Bullying Alliance website. They've got some teaching resources, they've got some films made by students. So if you're not already using them, have a look. They're really powerful and really effective. So a quick question then. 40% of 6 to 15-year-olds have been bullied in the past year. Do you think that's true or false? Answers in the chat. Just put a T or an F.
We've got one true, one false, so 50-50.
Okay.
More falses coming in, more trues. It seems to be more false than true. That's the votes. That's the consensus.
Okay. True. Sadly true. Now I have to put a bit of a rider on this. That in any given year, the rate of bullying can differ, and I'll show you later on in some of the slides. But in terms of an analysis of some of the bullying evidence and research, it normally kind of fluctuates between anything from 20% up to about 45%. And it really does depend on the way questions are phrased, the types of answers that children, and the types of way the data is collected. So I will put a bit of a rider on that. What I will say though is that 20% is 20% too many. So it doesn't really matter what the statistic is, but this is really shocking to think that up to 40% of children have potentially been bullied. So next question then, next true or false, 16,000 11 to 15-year-olds are absent from school at any one time due to bullying. Do we think that's true or false?
Getting a lot of votes for true so far.
True. Okay.
Yeah, everyone seems to be sticking with true.
Yes, true. Bullying has quite a significant impact on absence for children and young people. And again, you will probably be aware of that, but it's really quite significant in terms of the way that children do miss school and can miss school. In fact, when we did some work last year with children and young people, many of them said that they were quite relieved not to go to school, because the bullying had significantly reduced because they were learning online. So while some children were exposed to more cyberbullying, some of the children who were suffering bullying in a school context were actually given a little bit of a reprieve, and they quite enjoyed that. There was some evidence around that that was published last year. This is from a more recent report from the ONS, and sorry that's a bit blurry, but I think it's quite interesting that girls are twice as likely as boys to report that they've been cyberbullied, and the opportunity for cyberbullying increases as you get older. So you can see that at the age of 15, the likelihood of being bullied at 15 almost doubles from that of age 11. So the kind of main area, the main age group is that kind of secondary school age group, when most children are saying that, you know, that they had been bullied. And you can see here that actually the numbers around cyberbullying are quite low in relation to the other slide we've seen, 17.9 of 11 to 15-year-olds, but the age group is slightly different. So that one is a more reduced statistic than the other one we've just seen. The other thing that I think it's worth mentioning is the way that bullying has changed. So I used to work for an anti-bullying charity about 10 years ago, and at that time, because the online world wasn't as prevalent, not as many children were online, bullying was quite segmented. So often the children who experienced traditional bullying didn't experience online bullying. It was quite separate. There were only a third of children who experienced both. We're now moved into a very different arena where most children who are bullied offline are bullied online as well. So it's online is a kind of extension of the offline, or it can start the other way as well. But there isn't much difference in terms of being bullied online or offline. Most children are telling us, I think it's 90% of children are saying, actually, we're being bullied in all of these environments, and they're not mutually exclusive. And that's probably reflective of the amount of time that we're all spending online. So the way that we tackle some of this stuff has really got to consider both the online and the offline context. It's not one or the other. I wanted to just talk about bullying as a kind of social dynamic. It's a social phenomena, and it starts off as a kind of group behaviour, and you have a target, so you decide who that target's going to be, and you have a ringleader, and you have someone within that group who is the person who starts it off, kicks it off, and you could probably identify who those children might be within your context. Then you have the reinforcer. So you have someone who is reinforcing what the ringleader is doing and saying what they're perpetrating, what they're inflicting on the other person. And you have the assistant, so the person who is kind of facilitating, helping, and the defender as well. So it's a group dynamic. It's something that happens, and everybody within this group is trying not to become the target. So within this context, nobody wants to go from the reinforcer or the defender or the assistant to the target. Everybody wants to kind of maintain their roles, and it's a real kind of power struggle in terms of how children and adults operate within this environment. What you also have is an outsider, and sometimes this is sometimes known as the kind of bystander effect. So within this circle, you've probably got someone who's kind of slightly on the edge, who's not quite sure that what's happening is correct. And I just wanted, again, to just ask you very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, what can you identify in your context? What do you have the most of? What roles do you have the most of in your schools? So do you have more targets? Do you have more outsiders? Do you have more ringleaders? What kind of roles do you have in your schools? Just again, you can just put the initial, if you like, in the chat.
I reckon you probably have more outsiders. That's my opinion.
Yes, yeah. I think you're right. I mean, again, thank you, Jonathan. We didn't practice that, honestly.
No.
The evidence suggests that actually most children sit in that outsider sphere. And if you can tap into breaking down those dynamics and that power struggle, you can actually make more children move out of the circle than be in the circle. So instead of focusing on the kind of the target or the ringleader necessarily, if you're focusing on the positive power of the defender and the outsider, you can actually start to change some of that dynamic. And I think that also is very resonant with the online world as well. So if you can see people posting, sharing content, information that is not very nice and treats people in a particular way, promoting hate, promoting bullying, if you can try and support and educate children to be the outsider or the defender, so the person who's saying, actually, I don't think that's very nice, I don't think it's appropriate, we can start to change some of those dynamics. So definitely worth thinking about within the context that you're in. I'm just going to rattle through some of these other statistics as well, because I'm conscious of time. This is from Ditch the Label. Ditch the Label are a great charity who do lots and lots of work in this area. And this is their latest statistics around bullying. You can see in terms of the kind of breakdown of how children experienced it, social exclusion is becoming one of the top kind of areas that children are telling us they're experiencing. And on the right hand side, you can see how this is impacting on their mental health and some of the sorts of things that they're going through, which is why it's so important for us all to consider that. And then in terms of reporting, children encouragingly are reporting, which is absolutely great. One of the criticisms is that they sometimes don't get the feedback or the result that they need, not necessarily from schools, but certainly from social media and in the online context. They don't always know if the content's been taken down, which again, we can talk about very briefly later on. I'm going to move on just because I know that we're running out of time, and I know that Lulu and Craig want to talk about some of the Impero products that can kind of support this. But just before we do, again, just kind of reinforcing that in terms of parental worries, one of the big areas that parents are most worried about in the online context is their child getting bullied, because they know what a significant impact it can have on children's mental health and the way they feel about their lives in general. So lots of parents worried about this issue as well. I'm going to just skip over these, Lulu, because I think we need to.
Brilliant, thank you. I will also try and be quite speedy, just so we can get a few moments for questions at the end. So what Charlotte has mentioned and what we know about the Keeping Children Safe in Education updates, it's pretty clear that there is now a duty for schools that they have to ensure there is an appropriate filtering and monitoring system in place. And this doesn't mean that it is necessarily one piece of software. Charlotte, if you just move on to the next slide. So yeah, it can be one element added with the other elements that make that whole school approach. So with Impero Webcheck, it can be deployed and configured in many ways, and it can meet your needs. But the goal is to comb through the web traffic and use categorization to detect and prevent access to inappropriate or harmful sites under the chosen categories, such as cyberbullying, pornography, or extremism. Charlotte has briefly touched on this, and I'm sure she might at the end as well, but it adds to that whole school approach that we're trying to get to. So if we go on to the next slide. So there are commonly problematic platforms that we've touched on: Snapchat, Instagram, Facebooks, and some of the other ones as well. But if we actually look into the filtering process and focus on the categorization element, some sites are more straightforward in categorizing. So sites including nudity, sexual themes, and images are often sorted into the category of pornography. But when it comes to taking an anti-bullying approach to this, we have to think a bit differently. Cyberbullying sentiments are far more likely to be established from context clues, ongoing conversations, or in specific online environments. Using Webcheck to control when and who can access these spaces goes some way to controlling opportunities for teasing, bullying, or trolling activities. If you just go on to the next one. Yeah, so it can be really, really easy to just go a bit block crazy and restrict everything very, very tightly. But if we eliminate everything, we also reduce the chances for learning opportunities online, including the discussion on how to navigate the online world and resilience that might need to be built. So if we take this idea and put it into the school library, there are some books that you don't have in at all, some which only staff or older students can take out, and some which are only used for research or in a supervised way. Webcheck gives you the capacity to be more subtle in how these filters are applied. There's also some information on the 3 C's, 3, now 4 C's, but Charlotte touched on those, so I guess I'll leave that there. Yeah, I mean, the most effective block for inappropriate and harmful content online is to turn off the internet completely, but that doesn't give us any chance to learn about how to conduct ourselves online or how to respond to that. So changing your approach to online safety and applying filters rather than relying on blocking can be helpful, because you can also learn a lot about browsing trends for the users in your school. we go on to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, Webcheck reporting can help pinpoint what is being accessed as well as what people are attempting to access, which can build a picture of what students are browsing, and it can identify sites that are becoming more popular or sites of concern. Impero Webcheck gives you the ability to pull reports on individual students, classes, or entire year groups. Having this kind of insight can help your school track trends and, if need be, intervene. But it also helps you comply with the KICSI requirements on record keeping and reporting. If we think about a scenario, you pull a report of online usage and discover a group of year nines are trying to, or they are successfully accessing a potentially harmful site on their lunch break. You then have the ability to pass that report onto a DSL, and you can plan the next steps. So whether the conversation goes and you decide to set up an hourly, daily, or weekly alert, or you can track use, where you can track use over time, and discover the success of your interventions. Or you may want to limit the access to a certain time of day. You may want to block it entirely for a specific age group, or just while pupils are on site. This feature in particular can build and maintain the relationship between IT and safeguarding teams, so they can form that routine where they're both involved in protecting students. Whether you set the alert to run hourly, daily, or weekly, it's a very powerful tool. Yeah, and so if we combine this with monitoring, it means we can focus our efforts in combating cyberbullying in a more targeted and effective way. So yeah, just the last slide, please. So as I mentioned, Webcheck as a standalone product is great, it's wonderful. However, if you combine that with other products, it can really improve awareness and insight, and it's really, really important to track trends and monitor how your school is doing. So monitoring is how we supervise the online world, in the same way that we might supervise the playground. We look out for signs of trouble and intervene as soon as we can. Recording these online incidents robustly and combining these reports of offline concerns will establish a better picture of your school culture, as well as helping you to address the issues faced by individual students. Particularly with bullying, this is going to be crucial in identifying what schools are facing, who are the key players involved, and what topics or trends can be spotted. A culture of bullying or harassment cannot be tackled through blocking websites alone, but engaging with what is learned through that software. Through Webcheck, we can address the trends and we can educate students and staff. It becomes a supporting element in establishing an anti-bullying culture. An example that I think is really relevant right now is if we look at the everyone's invited. So that finding exposed a lot of systemic and endemic sexist bullying and sexual harassment experienced by many students across the country. And it showed us that there has to be a two-pronged approach when we support individuals affected by this, to make the whole school adjustment to policy and approach. With the granularity of configuration offered by Webcheck, filtering and monitoring come together to provide the evidence needed to make change, as well as showing what interventions you need to have the best success. That sort of finishes off my little bit. So Charlotte, I'm not sure if you've got a few extra bits that you can do, but it would be great if we could leave some time for questions. If anybody has questions, pop them in the chat box now, and hopefully we can get through those quickly.
Yeah, thank you, Lulu. I'm very conscious of time, and apologies, we are running out of time. But if you do have any questions, then pop them in the chat. And if we don't get a chance to answer them today, we can definitely reply to you via email if there's anything specific. I just wanted to quickly move on before we finish to thinking about what a kind of whole school approach to reporting might look like, and some of the issues that children tell us that kind of stops them coming forward and telling us what's going on for them. This slide is specifically around child sexual abuse, and this is evidence that really that what children are telling us is the kind of fear that they have around telling professionals and telling teachers about what's been happening to them. And I know that this is quite specific to child sexual abuse, which is different to bullying, but some of the reasons why children aren't disclosing, aren't sharing information are very similar in relation to bullying as they are to child sexual abuse. And you can see that one of the ones that sticks out to me is that kind of being labelled as a snitch by peers, which often does prevent children from sharing information. So what we know then is that children often find it hard to report, although we do know more girls than boys report. We can use pieces of information to understand what's going on for the child. So we can use the information that we have around your offline reporting, so the way that you might be recording safeguarding incidents or behaviour incidents. We can use the information that we have about children's behaviour in the classroom. We can use some of the web check material, the monitoring material, to help us to really build a picture around a child, to really think about what's going on for them. Schools and professionals need to demonstrate a zero tolerance. You will all know that having strong anti-bullying policies is really important. Always challenging low-level behaviour. We've seen today the England cricketer talking about some of the racist bullying that he was the recipient of, gone completely unchallenged, completely unrecognised by what it seems are both the ECB and senior leaders within cricketing, and the impact that that has on a person. It stops them from disclosing, it stops them from sharing, it makes them keep it all in. So really significant. And the key one is that schools, one of the criticisms of schools is that we are still relying too much on children coming and telling us. We've got to make it dead easy for them to share what's going on. And most importantly, they need a resolution, they need a response. Even if it can't be resolved in the way that they would like it to be, they need feedback and they need some sort of resolution. Again, just kind of reinforcing what's in the new Keeping Children Safe in Education, one of the changes. They list the changes at the start of the document, and it really does make it very explicit that schools should be thinking about the reporting system that they have in place for children and young people to report any kind of abuse, not just bullying, but any kind of abuse. So it needs to be simple and accessible. It needs to be fast. It needs to be non-threatening. I need to be able to report something in a way that is not going to make me fearful of the repercussions. It needs to be not just specific behaviour, but also children need to be able to share what they're worried about, what they're suspicious about, not just actually so-and-so did this on this day. They need to be able to share the little things as well. It needs to link with other forms of information gathering. So some of the ones that we've already mentioned today, and they need to report it without fear of repercussion, and they need to get some kind of feedback. Lots of schools choose to do this via an email, or they choose to do it via online systems, or the old traditional bully boxes in the corner of the classroom where the kids post in their worries or concerns. However you do it, I would just recommend that you use that kind of first bullet point as your kind of principle. Simple and easily accessible. Make it visible, make it non-threatening for children. Make sure that you model behaviour and demonstrate that actually anyone who uses this system will get some kind of response and feedback. And very quickly, I'm going to talk about the whole school approach to digital safeguarding. Again, some of you may have seen this before, but this is essentially a three-legged stool. And if you don't have all of these bits in place, it falls over. So make sure you've got the right policies and practices in place. You have a safeguarding policy, which includes online. You might have a social media policy. You'll definitely have an anti-bullying policy. Make sure that your policies and practices reflect what's really going on in your school. Your infrastructure and technology is set up in such a way that it protects children. It's in compliance with the 4 C's, not the 3 C's. You'll have filtering, you may have monitoring as well. You might have firewalls. So just make sure that all of that approach is encapsulated and you have the appropriate technological solutions for your setting, for your students, for your school. You need to make sure that you educate your children, your parents and your staff. So making sure that the curriculum contains up-to-date information in relation to some of the online harms that we've been talking about, that you can educate parents and support parents, point them to advice and information, drip feed parents, invite them in so that they can come and see what their kids have been doing in Anti-Bullying Week, making sure that that kind of ongoing dialogue with parents is in place. And then finally, all of that is supported by your reviewing and your approach to all of those 3 areas, so that every year you have a reflective look at what's going on and make sure that everything is in place. And I'm 1 minute over, I think. So I'm just going to flick to the last slide and say we haven't got time for Q&A. Apologies, I'm going to take responsibility for that, me bad. But if you do have any questions, myself and Lulu's email is on the screen. If there are any questions in the chat, we'll make sure that we come back to you. Thank you very much for listening and for taking time out of your day. As I say, if there are any questions, please do come back to us, and I hope you found that useful. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye.